Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Michael Finney. Today, I am joined again by Hans Schantz. Would you like to say hello, sir?
Hello, and thank you for having me on again.
You know, it's been a while. We talked in January, I think. Since then, you've let me curate a couple of niche sales for the based book sale. I do appreciate that. How has the based book sale gone so far in 2025?
We have had a very solid year. Last year, the based book sale moved about 5,000 books from indie authors into the hands of based readers, thanks to the niche sales, the ones that you curated, and our recent sale of based books for male readers, as well as the two of the 4 quarterly sales we've had so far. We're already on top of that. We've got about 6,000 so far year to date. So we're on track for at least 10 or 12 with the 2 quarterly sales that we have left. We have one coming up right after Labor Day, and our final sale is our Black Friday sale that runs over Thanksgiving, Black Friday, and Cyber Monday. So lots more opportunities to connect based readers with based authors coming up.
Yeah, very much looking forward to that. And I think that what you have going there is a fantastic vehicle for indie writers in general to connect with an audience that's looking for material that they can't find in a lot of places, or is difficult to find, or is not being, they're as an audience, they're not being catered to, or as a class of writers, they're not being supported top down from the mainstream traditional publishing and stuff. So I think that you do a great service in that sense.
Well, thank you very much. I do think it fills a void. Inevitably, indie authors discover that writing their story is half the battle and the other half is having to market it. So we all work in our own little domains trying to build a following and build a mailing list and build awareness among readers of what we have. The based book sale allows authors to come together and pool their resources, network together, and exchange the best of the based indie author community with all of our readers. So I think the authors and the readers benefit from what goes on. But it's really the power of the sale is in all the authors who contribute. I just kind of sit at the center and try to coordinate things as best I can.
Yeah, it's done very well. You know, I have benefited from it as a writer, and I think that the more people that find it, the stronger it will continue to be. And this is the thing too, in terms of vehicles for promoting or making projects come to life. Let's talk about your most recent project, the Fund My Comic campaign for Fields and Energy Book 1. Tell us how that came about, why you chose to go with Fund My Comic, anything you feel like is important in terms of the narrative and how we got to that point.
Well, certainly my first attempt at crowdfunding a book on Kickstarter was my novel Wise of Heart, a courtroom drama of biological science versus transgenderism that brings the Scopes monkey trial up to date for the 21st century. Kickstarter approved the campaign. It was fully funded, and just a few days from closing when they changed their mind and canceled the campaign and refunded all of my backers' money. And Fund My Comics stepped up and allowed me to re-platform my sale there. We ended up doubling the backing that the book had acquired on Kickstarter, so it was actually a very positive experience for me to be canceled on Kickstarter. I was weighing whether I would go just straight to Fund My Comic on my next project on Fields and Energy, and had a number of friends say that I really ought to give Kickstarter a try, and I thought I'd see if I could get Kickstarter to work for me. And they canceled me again. My project got canceled. They used the excuse that there was too much AI content in my project. I had an AI-generated cover for one of the novellas that was an add-on to it. So, the covers for the main book, Fields and Energy, and then the fictional novels that I have, probably over $1,000 in human cover art that I've invested in making that happen, were trumped by having the novella add-on with an AI cover. And I also acknowledged using AI to generate my index and a few other things, but that was the excuse that they latched onto to cancel me a second time. And yet again, Fund My Comics came to my rescue, and I was able to get my book platformed over there for the crowdfund, and it's going along very well so far. Well over 100 backers, and the site has really worked very well for me. So I strongly recommend indie authors, particularly if you have anything the least bit controversial, to take a good look at Fund My Comics. It's less hassle. You don't have to worry about them yanking the rug out from underneath you. And one of the features that's particularly good about Fund My Comics is you can run a campaign where they will send you the money as you earn it. So over the course of the campaign, I've already gone and spent about $500 on buying some of the things I'm going to need to fulfill the campaign when it ends. So it makes the cash flow a little easier, so you don't have to wait for the money to come in until everything's all the way over. So that's the narrative on the fundraising side. The book is Fields and Energy. The overall project is how electromagnetism and quantum mechanics work and where physics went wrong. The project grew to the point where I had to split it into 3 books. So, I don't know if that's bad news or good news for the people who've been following it, that there will be 3 times as many offerings in it. But definitely good news is the first book now is ready to be released and for readers to read. It compiles material I've serialized on my Substack at etherzar.substack.com. The first book is Fundamentals and Origins of Electromagnetism. And I work through the history of how electromagnetic science developed, and it's really about the philosophy and history of science as much as it is about the details of electromagnetism. I wrote it as best I could at a level where curious students and intelligent lay people, as well as professionals who are looking for some better answers about what electromagnetism is and how it works, would all have an interest in reading the book. So that's the goal of the project.
Yeah, very nice. Just to note, it looks like your campaign will be closing at the end of August this month, the 31st, 9 p.m. Eastern time for those that are interested. So by the time this airs, there will be a little bit of time left to get involved with the Fund My Comic campaign. Now, here is, I think, one question that I think all of us really want to know the answer to in regards to the Society for Post-Quantum Research. And that is this: how often do you think of Rome?
Much more often now that I have my Roman-themed logo for my research. I decided that if I was going to reintroduce classical physics concepts into modern physics, into quantum mechanics, that it would be nice to have a umbrella organization and a logo to reflect that. So I selected SPQR, the Society for Post-Quantum Research. The website for that is thespqr.com. And I adopted as a logo a stylized Roman eagle sigil. So you'll see that on my Substack as well as at thespqr.com.
Yeah, good design. And here's the thing too, really turning out a brand and experience and creating a community this is something that I think that you are getting not only a lot of traction on, but a lot of experience with. Is that something that you are becoming more considerate of as a result of some of the other stuff you've been doing and the traction you've gained with it? Or is it just by nature? What, tell us about that.
Well, I did start, but my original Substack was something that I put together to serialize the Whys of Heart. And I think that worked very well. I got a number of readers following the updates on Substack and even backing me, although just about everything on the Substack was free. So that worked very well, building a community and getting some momentum going into the crowdfund to try to build a brand and build a community. I've unfortunately realized once Whys of Heart was over and I had finished writing it and the book was released, there really wasn't much more to do with that group. So I ended up putting it on hiatus. I'll probably eventually revive it when I'm ready to work on fiction again and just make it a Substack for my fiction work as new fiction is coming out. But I got too busy between running the based book Substack and that community and then developing my Fields and Energy community and the SPQR. So, I mean, there's only so many communities you can try to grow simultaneously without getting spread too thin.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair. Now, let's dive into a little bit of the actual nuts and bolts of the topic, right? Fields and energy. What are you implying with the title of the books?
What I am offering is a broad-based and fundamental attack on our modern understanding of electromagnetism. My thesis is that the electromagnetic pioneers of the 19th century, people like Faraday and Maxwell and Heaviside and Hertz, had some very powerful and now largely forgotten insights about what electromagnetism is and how it works. In modern thinking, electromagnetism is thought to be due to one entity, a photon, which simultaneously combines the mutually contradictory properties of being a particle and a wave in one entity. And it leads to no end of paradox and confusion. In my thinking, electromagnetism is due to two things: fields, which are non-local and behave like waves, and the fields guide the flow of energy, which in the quantum limit looks like particles. So in my thinking, electromagnetism isn't one thing, a photon, it's two things, fields and energy, hence the title. The modern conception of how radiation works is physicists assume that if you wiggle or accelerate a charge, out pops a photon from the charge, and that's their model of radiation. But there's a Taoist cone about considering the sound of one hand clapping. And of course, if you start to consider the sound of one hand clapping, what you realize is that that makes no sense because it takes two hands in order to clap. And the concept of one hand clapping is nonsensical. You've reduced clapping to a point where you can't explain it if you're only looking at one hand. Well, that's precisely what modern physics has done with radiation. The radiation of one charge accelerating makes no more sense than the sound of one hand clapping, because just as with applause, it takes at least two charges in order to have that acceleration, in order to have radiation. You have to have two charges as in what's called a dipole, or you have to have one charge in an area where you've got a bunch of other charges setting up an electric field to cause that acceleration. And I can go into a lot more detail, but I think that summarizes the difference between my thinking and the conventional wisdom in a nutshell.
Sure, there is one thing I would like you to expand on, which I think refers at least to one thing that you said here. So give us a little bit more on what the quantum limit is.
If you look at smaller and smaller quantities of energy, you begin to discover that it's quantized, that instead of being a continuum, it comes in discrete parts. That is something that was discovered in the very late 19th century, early 20th century with the discovery of something called the photoelectric effect. It turned out that only light of a certain color was able to kick electrons out of a metal surface, that you couldn't have lots of low frequency light, that it had to be high frequency light in order to make it happen. And between that and a physicist named Max Planck, who is trying to understand something called black body radiation. If you have a cavity that is heated to a temperature and infrared radiation coming out the aperture of the cavity, it follows a certain spectral distribution. And in order to explain that distribution, Planck had to argue that the energy comes in discrete chunks, that it's not a continuum. So between those two experiments and the emerging experimental measurements that were being made, physicists realized that energy is quantized. And that led to a great number of insights in atomic physics, from the Bohr model and the early quantum theory to the more sophisticated theory of quantum mechanics in the 1920s.
What I'm hearing is it's an issue of scale in general.
Yes, on the macroscopic scale, for most applications, particularly if you're in doing radio wave or antenna engineering, which is something I do, you really don't have to worry about having quanta of energy or dealing with individual photons. It's only when you start dealing with atomic physics and atomic processes, things that are happening on a very small scale, that it starts to come up.
Let's think a little bit even more abstractly, right? In the sense of like dimensional concepts. When you start talking about this size, this scale, how many dimensions are we trying to think in? Are we measuring in?
Well, we're still dealing with just the three spatial dimensions and a dimension of time. And if you want to deal with moving inertial reference frames, you can deal with the space-time coordinates to transfer from one coordinate system to another to look at things a little different way. So in totality, 4 dimensions. I'm not looking at any sort of higher order geometry or string field or string theory that requires more than just the usual 3+1 dimensions.
Yeah, that was where I'm headed. How do you feel about some of these theoretical concepts in string theory, going all the way up to 10-dimensional physics, 11-dimensional physics? How does what you're talking about now fit in with some of that thinking, or fight against some of that thinking, in coordination with the things that we've talked about on this very small scale to almost this very abstract, theoretical, intangible scale as well?
I guess it really isn't terribly relevant, because the mathematics can be enormously complex, and there's a lot you can do with mathematics in order to explain things that are going on in reality. The mathematician John von Neumann famously said, give me 4 points and I can plot an elephant for you. Make it 5 and I'll make him wag his tail. With sufficiently complicated mathematics, you're able to model a extremely complicated set of data. And I think that's largely what's being done with string theory. They're using very elaborate geometrical models to try to match the observed particle spectrum and the behavior of the particle zoo that you get when you make particles collide at very high energies. And what I'm doing is really just a revival of a more 19th century approach to physics and to a 19th century way of looking at how physics works.
So do you see what you're doing fitting into the math that we have continued to progress on since the 19th century? Or do you see some of those things being just purely exercise and maybe not necessarily applicable to the line of physics that you are driving on?
Well, it's a mixture of both. What I'm specifically doing really doesn't require anything beyond the usual 19th century vector calculus and the mathematics of understanding electromagnetics as a vector field theory. Now, that's not to say that all of 20th century math is wrong. There are certainly very many valuable things that were developed in the development of quantum mechanics to predict and model what's going on. My concern is that physicists have moved away from an approach to physics in which we try to model and understand the fundamental behavior. They've moved toward a model where shut up and calculate is the mantra of the day, where it's argued that models will just confuse you because they're always they always have some flaws. They are maps and not the territory itself. And therefore, we shouldn't even bother trying to understand what's going on in terms of a model. I reject that thinking because if you try to think of physics while trying to reject all models, inevitably what you do is you are implicitly thinking of what's going on in terms of a model that you are taking for granted instead of something that's well thought out and a deliberate choice. For instance, the example I gave of how physicists think of radiation as being a charge wiggling and a photon popping out. That leads to a problem called the problem of radiation reaction, where the reaction force exerted by the radiation of that emitted photon is going to cause a reaction force that accelerates the charge further, which means you get more radiation, which means you get more acceleration, and so on, leading to an exponential runaway of the charge acceleration. And that, of course, isn't physical. That's not what happens. If it did, then anytime you tried to move anything, it would rapidly accelerate up to the speed of light, and everything in the neighborhood would be destroyed in a burst of high energy radiation. So clearly that theory is wrong.
Endless cascade until collapse, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you don't think clearly and carefully about your models, you're going to end up accepting a model implicitly, like the whole wiggle a charge and a photon pops out model, and it's going to lead you astray and it's going to lead you into error.
Interesting. It's wild to hear some of the reckoning, if that's the right way to phrase it, and to look back at something that, I would assume a lot of people think is satisfied, and to then kind of reopen the book and to begin to try and right the ship in that sense.
Yeah, it was very interesting for me as I came across and developed these ideas. I'm still just stunned that someone like Heaviside or Hertz could have overlooked the discoveries and the insights that I've come across. You can look at, for instance, in Heaviside's work, Electrical Papers, where he talks about what happens if you have identical waves that are moving along a transmission line, so that they're going in opposite directions and they will interfere with each other. And if you have mirror image waves, they'll interfere with each other. And as the waves are isolated by themselves, they have a balance of electric and magnetic energy. If they come together constructively, what happens is all of the magnetic energy changes into electric energy. If they come together destructively, then all of the electric energy changes into magnetic energy. And Heaviside describes that process in some detail. He clearly understood how moving waves at the speed of light have a balance of energy, and how when you do an interference, you get that balance upset and the energy becomes electrostatic or magnetostatic. But he didn't take the next step of realizing, wait a moment, if that energy is becoming static, it's stopped, and the waves are moving on past at the speed of light. So how can that be? The answer is the energy actually changes direction. The energy bounces, and the energy that was associated with the forward wave ends up associated with the reverse wave, and vice versa. So that's what I mean by my theory of fields and energy. They take different trajectories in an electromagnetic system. In that example, the fields pass straight through each other, the forward and reverse wave. They pass through each other at the speed of light, but the energy they carry, if they're mirror image waves, that energy comes to a rest and is exchanged from one wave to the other. And surprisingly, somehow, Heaviside never picked up on that, even though he had an accurate description of the physical process involved, of the shift from the balance to magnetostatic or electrostatic energy. And in fact, Heaviside is the one who came up with the formula for the energy velocity of electromagnetic energy. And he just didn't, he had all the pieces and he didn't put them together to get the insight that these had to be two different things, that the fields were guiding the flow of energy, and that the fields and energy could take different paths through our systems.
He was too close to it, you know? Somebody else had to come from a different approach to be able to make sense out of it and advance the thinking. That's just how it goes a lot of times.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I first stumbled across one of the key pieces of evidence when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, trying to understand how energy decouples from an antenna and radiates away. And I had a very clear example that the energy that ends up being radiated away didn't come from the antenna itself. It came from a separate, distinct place stored in the fields. And even though I saw that, even though I calculated it, even though I published papers on that, I didn't get the big picture that that was a general principle of electromagnetism, of all processes, and that fields and energy have to be two different things because they take different paths, different space-time trajectories in electromagnetic systems.
Well, Hans, are there things that we haven't yet talked about that you feel are important to get into the discussion?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand a lot of how we got to where we are in physics today. And that's why I took a historical approach, because I really wanted to understand how it was possible for physics to get so far off track, and what were the philosophical, the historical, the social, the political issues involved in what drives the course of science in particular, and human events in general. For instance, one person I talk about a lot in my book is Francis Bacon. And he was a very interesting character. Modern scholarship suggests that he may well have been the illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth I. A number of people suggest that he may have written or at least coordinated the writing of Shakespeare's plays. But what is pretty much uncontroversial is that he played a pioneering role in our modern view of science. He wrote a number of books about arguing how science should be done. And ironically, he took a look at the people who were doing good science that he was associated with, people like William Gilbert, who was the court physician for Queen Elizabeth, who did pioneering work on understanding magnetism, or like William Harvey, who did pioneering work understanding the circulatory system. And Bacon did not appreciate their work. He thought they were dabblers, that they were just focusing too narrowly on a particular subject. Instead, Bacon argued that science should be collectively organized and put to use to enhance the power and capability of the human race. And he wrote a wonderful little, I guess we'd call it a science fiction novella nowadays, called The New Atlantis. It's relatively short, 40 or 50 pages, depending on the font size of the edition that you come across. But what he describes is how how explorers or travelers from England end up marooned on this island, and they discover that on the island is an institution called Solomon's House that is governing and organizing all of the scientific investigation of this kingdom. And the scholars there have all manner of resources that have been made available to them to do their important work, all kinds of facilities. They have copious assistants and apprentices who are assisting them in their endeavors. They're divided into people who go to foreign lands to learn what the foreigners know and bring the knowledge back, people who make observations, people who conduct experiments, people who look at experimental results and analyze them, people who look at those analyses and come up with new experiments. It's amazing how he treats scientific investigation as something that can be subject to that division of labor down to very, very fine degrees. And ultimately, the scientists of this institution are responsible for deciding what science they will make available to the kingdom and to the kingdom's rulers and the kingdom's people, what's in their best interests. It's really a foreshadowing of the modern technocratic state. And what's also very fascinating is that about 40 years or so after Bacon's death, the Royal Society was founded by Charles II when he came back to England in the Restoration. And just 6 years after the founding of the Royal Society, they published a history of the Royal Society, which explicitly called out Francis Bacon as being its inspiration. It was full of Masonic imagery, even though Freemasons had not publicly revealed themselves and wouldn't until, I think, 1717. In 1660, it was very clear that they were deeply involved in the Royal Society. So you take a look at that, and you can see in Francis Bacon and Francis Bacon's work and his acknowledged legacy, like the Royal Society, you can see the birth of scientism, the cult of science, believe science, trust the scientists, do what the scientists tell you, don't question them. That really saw its birth in 17th century England under the direction of Francis Bacon. And just following that historical trajectory is really helpful for understanding how physics went wrong, how it got so centralized and so subject to groupthink to end up in the place that it is today.
I think the phrase we're looking for in summation is trust the experts.
Oh, that's the fundamental tenet of technocracy and scientism.
Well, hey, this has gone well. A good catch up, a good conversation, a good addendum to our previous session. In fact, I would say, even with a little bit of technological misstep in the beginning, which no one is going to hear, because we retract all this stuff. Luckily,
the power of editing,
the power of technology. In fact, in the future, they're going to say, what did they really talk about on that lost recording before the recording that we ended up getting published, right?
Yeah, an endless chain of, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? What about now? Testing 1, 2, 3. Well, it's fascinating that the internet is really, there are people pushing the internet to be a tool for both physical and intellectual control, that it should be a centralized institution for allowing the technocrats to micromanage and monitor all of us. But at the same time, the internet is also an unprecedented tool for the independent thinking people to compare notes, to share research, to share ideas. And it's really exciting living in times like these, where you have so many people who are caught up in just believing what they're told, who are the non-player characters or NPCs who just move along through their rote algorithms that have been programmed into them. It makes it very refreshing to be able to reach out and to connect with the genuinely independent and creative thinkers out there. And that's what I'm doing in my science, and that's what we're all doing together through the based book sale and through indie writing.
Absolutely. 100% agree, and do appreciate your efforts. Hans, again, thank you for taking the time, and we'll talk again before too long.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me on.